What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Young World Leader Summit. For those of you who I don't know, my name's Langley. I'm with the Summit team. And whew, 2020. Been quite the year, right? Especially rough over here in the live event space. But we've pivoted and we've built two new things that we're really excited to tell you about. The first is we built our own nonprofit called Summit Impact, which this weekend is all about. So throughout the year, we'll be building programming around environmental stewardship, criminal justice, the future of work. The list goes on, lots of updates coming. And then the second thing is we built our first year-round version of Summit called Summit Junto, where we handpick 7 people within the Summit community to form your personalized leadership board. And then we'll be able to build really intimate, beautiful live events on the other side of this. So if you want to find out any more on any of this, you can head over to our website, www.summit.co. And now, excited to hand it over to our talented MC, Michelle Antoinette, to kick off the weekend.
I was born in the middle of a civil war, and since then, my whole life, I have had war around me, around my family. This war, the war against the FARC, this war was a brutal war. We had so many massacres, so many days. People started to get immune to seeing people die. That's why we had to stop this war, to end the war. You must continue to try to bring peace to this country, otherwise Colombia will have no future. If you have a port of destiny, no matter what type of winds you have against you, you can use them to get to your port. You must continue, persevere.
Muchas gracias, bendiciones.
I sincerely hope that the peace we reached will be a peace that will last forever, and it's a peace that changed the course of our country for the better.
What you just saw was a trailer for a film called Port of Destiny, which was made about the man who will be joining us today. Former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, has earned international praise, including a Nobel Peace Prize for architecting a peace agreement which ended 5 decades of civil war that left some 260,000 people dead and 8 million displaced. Now, in this first-of-a-kind conversation with cultural anthropologist Wade Davis and President Santos, we'll get to learn about the country's history, what it took to achieve the historic deal, the political price of peace, and the future of Colombia. Now, before we hear from President Santos, hear from a woman who benefited directly from President Santos's peace-building work in Colombia.
Soy Viviana Palacio Raigosa, del movimiento de Mujeres Jóvenes Yo Puedo, un movimiento de mujeres jóvenes que le apuesta a la construcción de paz en el departamento del Meta, un territorio rico en flora, fauna, fuentes hídricas y sobre todo multicultural, étnico y agrícola. En este territorio hermoso, nuestra generación ha tenido que crecer en medio del conflicto, pero especialmente esta guerra se ha ensañado con los más excluidos y en especial con nosotras las mujeres, pues nuestro cuerpo, nuestro territorio, nuestros sueños, nuestras autonomías, nuestros hogares se han visto muy afectados por este conflicto armado, pero también El conflicto ha hecho que tengamos que salir de nuestro territorio, que tengamos que estar calladas y que muchas veces nuestro cuerpo sea utilizado como un botín de guerra. Entendiendo que la paz es un asunto intergeneracional y que se concreta en el territorio, es para nuestro proceso muy importante ser aliadas del Fondo Humanitario para la Mujer, la Paz y la Acción Humanitaria. Pues con esta alianza seguiremos promoviendo la participación efectiva de las mujeres, seguiremos siendo tomadoras de decisión, pero sobre todo caminaremos con 200 mujeres en los territorios para seguir construyendo paz. La paz nos ha traído la posibilidad de soñar un departamento diferente, en donde lo importante no sea correr para salvar nuestras vidas, sino defender nuestro territorio, pero sobre todo para que en esta inmensa y hermosa llanura los sueños de todas y todos sean una realidad. Es para nosotras un honor darle la bienvenida al expresidente Juan Manuel Santos en esta sesión El largo camino hacia la paz. Pero además es muy significativo que el largo camino hacia la paz se abra aquí en el Meta, en San Juan de Arama, en donde el indio acostado le coquetea la sabana.
Well, hello, everybody. It's my honor to be here with you today, to be able to be part of a conversation with a man that I admire enormously, that the world admires incredibly, the president of Colombia who brought peace to the nation, Juan Manuel Santos. And before we launch into our conversation, I just want to stress that what you saw in those videos is a face of Colombia, a Colombian nation that is engaged in this peace process, that wants peace, that is tired of war, but a country that is not simply a place of violence. It's a land, I always say, of colores y cariño, of colors and love, with the greatest natural beauty and wealth and diversity to be found on the planet. There is no place in Colombia more than one day removed from every natural habitat to be found on Earth. Only in Colombia can you walk ashore on a desert coast, move through wetlands that shine to the heavens like great mirrors to the sky, move through tropical forests and climb up into bucolic, verdant Andean valleys scored by white-capped mountains, as extraordinary as any to be found on the planet. Yes, Colombia has suffered. As we heard, 260,000 dead, 8 million displaced. But critically, through a 50-year war, there were never more than 300,000 combatants in a nation of 50 million. The vast majority of Colombians were innocent victims caught in the vice of war, a war that would not have lasted a week had it not been for the illicit money brought in by the cocaine trade. 70% of the revenues of the paramilitaries came from the drug. In the last year before President Santos negotiated the agreement that brought FARC in from the forest, the FARC made $600 million from extortion and trafficking. Well, if you give me the Beverly Hills Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc throughout Southern California. And yet, through all of these years, incredibly, Colombia, convulsed by conflict, nevertheless maintained civil society and democracy, grew its economy, greened its cities, created millions of acres of national parks in a system that already was the crown jewel of Latin America, and sought restitution with indigenous people in a way that cannot be matched by any nation state, even as the nation made its way towards peace, a peace agreement that means that now 2 generations of young Colombians forced to flee the conflict are returning to the nation with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor, setting the stage for an economic, social, cultural, even spiritual renaissance, unlike anything seen in Latin America. And I stress that simply so that we all understand that in some sense, we all are responsible for the fate of Colombia. We all have its agonies in our hearts. Imagine how the Americans would feel, for example, if Canada had patterns of drug consumption, laws that facilitated the creation of a black market, but enforcement of those laws so lax as to do nothing to that market, such that 85 million Americans were forced to flee their homes. Well, proportionately, that's what happened to Colombia. And yet, mercifully, even if the world may be seen to be falling apart, Colombia is falling together. And the individual most responsible for that is President Juan Manuel Santos, a warrior who found his way to peace and devoted his entire legacy, all of his political, personal, I would dare say spiritual capital, on an unrelenting pursuit of a peace agreement that means a new dawn for the nation. Problems remain, but problems can be solved. So it's with great honor and delight that I bring you and introduce to you President Juan Manuel Santos.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers of the summit for inviting me, for giving me this great honor. And thank you, Wade, for this too generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with you, a person who knows Colombia better than many Colombians. I tell my compatriots that to read your books, especially your last book about the most important river in Colombia, the Magdalena River, that is a great text of Colombian history, Colombian culture, and Colombian beauty. As one of our great writers said, your book, Wade, is a love letter to Colombia, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you so much, President Santos. I mean, I think one of the, Colombia is so misunderstood that you see it's even the name itself misspelled consistently by North Americans. And yet here we have a country of such extraordinary historical resonance. If you think about even going back to the conquest, all the attention goes to Peru and Mexico as if Colombia was a sideshow. But in fact, Colombia sent more wealth to Spain than the other two countries. Colombia was a much more difficult topography to conquer. I mean, Pizarro just had to walk across the beaches in Tumbes in Peru to meet the Inca. The conquistadores in Colombia had to sort of endure hell to get to the kingdom of the Muisca, where the capital city of Bogota now lies today. And yet at the same time, Colombia is not just a place of violence. It's a fountain of culture, of music, of poetry and prayer with these rich literary traditions. We always talk about from Gabo, who, when he passed away, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you famously called him the greatest Colombian to ever live. And he was said to have, sparked this new way of writing, magical realism, that sort of was said to be Colombia's gift to Latin American literature in particular. But Gabo was a journalist. He was an observer, a functioning journalist all his life who just wrote about what he saw. He just happened to live, as I wrote in the new book, in a land where heaven and earth come together on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine.
Absolutely. And speaking about Garcia Marquez, I remember one time that somebody, a very old lady, was telling him an anecdote, a story, and he suddenly stopped her and said, here is the answer to many people who ask me, where do I get my inspiration to write about this magical realism? It's the stories of the Colombian people, and Colombian people that have a tremendous diversity. Going back to another great Latin American writer, Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican writer who wrote about our history, Latin American culture. He used to say, he was my teacher at Harvard, and he used to say, of all the countries in Latin America, the most interesting and powerful country is Colombia because of its tremendous diversity. Mm-hmm. That diversity gives Colombia a special strength. And just to give you an example of how diverse we are, the peace process, the text of the peace process, had to be translated into 65 different dialogues.
Wow.
Because of our institution, 65. And you know, Wade, because you know our country, you go to different regions and you find different music, you find a different way of speaking Spanish with different accents, uh, different food, but that is what has made Colombia strong.
Well, one of the things that people may not understand is that there are today, for example, in absolute numbers, more indigenous people alive in Colombia than there were at the time of the Spanish conquest. You have the fourth largest Afro-American, Afro-Caribbean community in the world, and the diversity of the culture finds its way in the poetry of the place. You know, ethnomusicologists say that Colombia is a land of 1,000 rhythms, but they've actually identified 1,025. And when I spoke with Carlos Vivas, the great Colombian legendary musician, he said that all of our music reflects our landscape. And the mother of all of our music is cumbia, the mother of porro, merengue, salsa, tambora. But he said the mother of cumbia is the river, the Rio Magdalena. And you have this interaction between landscape and character. People can hardly believe that for most of Colombian history, all of transport was on the back of a mule. At a time when cities like Bogota were called the Athens of South America, because of the incredibly difficult topography, virtually everything you found in the capital had to be imported and on a back of a mule from the mother Magdalena. And this geography created such diversity. And, the Amazon of Colombia, the most beautiful Amazon section of the Amazon in the entire basin, the size of France, virtually roadless to this day. The Choco forests of the Pacific, the three great arms of the Andean Cordillera going up to the Caribbean coastal plains where the wetlands just are so stunningly beautiful. And so that the diversity is reflected in the people. And yet at the same time, for all the diversity, the people have a tremendous sense of patriotism. On a recent Colombian census, fully 80% of Colombians said they had no particular ethnic identity because they feel this power of the nation, which is so beautiful.
Yes, and you were talking about our music. Anybody who really wants to learn how to dance should come to Colombia. This is the paradigm for anybody who likes to dance. And you're talking about the indigenous communities. I have learned to admire them. I've tried to learn from them for the last years, and the more I go into their way of thinking, their culture, the more identified I feel with them, especially in today's world. They are probably the best guardians of our biodiversity. They are the ones who really appreciate the environment and the richness that we have in Colombia and in the world. I remember when I became president, I went to an indigenous community, probably the oldest one in the whole of the Americas, the Mamos of something called the Sierra Nevada. It's a high mountain, the highest in the world, near to the ocean, to the Caribbean Ocean. And I asked for their permission to go to Congress and swear and inaugurate myself. And they said to me, President Santos, this is a great gesture. No other president has given us that honor. They gave me a stick. I have it here, as a matter of fact. I always carry it with me. This is the stick that they gave me, and they said, "We give you our blessing, and we ask you to make peace among Colombians, but also peace with nature, because we have treated nature very badly. We have disrespected the value of nature, and Mother Nature is mad, and she has a form of retaliating, and they tell me that I was going to suffer this retaliation. And the worst Niña phenomenon that we have ever had for 2 years started in Colombia. And that, for me, was a great lesson. I started to speak to them frequently, and what I have learned, and in today's discussion, how can we build back better? How can we get out of this pandemic in a better way? We should hear the indigenous communities, their advice. They are saying this pandemic is also a consequence of the disconnection between human beings and nature. And it is. The pandemic started as a phenomenon that is a virus that comes from animals to human beings. And that is because we are destroying nature. So that tremendous biodiversity and the cultural diversity is something that we have to really appreciate and take into account right now in order to get out of this pandemic and, as they say, build back better, because I think Colombia has all the potential to be much better than before, especially because now we don't have this war against the FARC that was a way of, like a break in our development, in our effort to create a more just society. But now that we have this war over, and that this pandemic has also helped us to see much more clearly the problems that we have, not only Colombia, the whole world, I think we have a great opportunity to build back much better.
Well, I think, just for those who don't know the groups that the president was referring to, these are the mamos of the elder brothers, the Arahuacos, the Wiwa, the Cancuano, and the Okogi. These are literally sun priests who are descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain. And it speaks so much about Colombia that, 500 years after the conquest, the voice of that kind of society is not only there to inform the world, but is being listened to by the highest political authorities in Colombia. And if there's ever been a peace dividend from the violence, it is the fact, as the president said, that for 50 years, because of the war, many areas of Colombia were off limits for industrial development. And so, for example, a neighboring country like Ecuador, who made decisions in the 1970s about oil development, pipelines, colonization, deforestation, basically compromised its lowland forests. And yet Colombia was left alone. And now Colombia is in a position to make decisions about the natural wealth of the nation, informed by 50 years of scientific research and the voices of indigenous people that simply were not heard or did not exist half a century ago when the plight of Ecuador was determined. So Colombia, in a very exciting way, has an opportunity, unlike any other nation in Latin America. As I said, the Colombian Amazon, although now threatened, is the size of France, and it's largely roadless. So Colombia is in a position to really determine its destiny, which is extraordinary.
No, and the war, and this is a paradox and an irony, in terms of our protection of our biodiversity, was a kind of a blessing in disguise, precisely because of the war, lots of regions were out of bounds, and they were then preserved. The big challenge now that we now have peace is to keep preserving them, to stop deforestation. The Amazon, and we have, for example, a park called the Chiribiquete Park in the middle of the Amazon. It's larger than the Serengeti Park in Africa. But the concentration of biodiversity in that park is extraordinary. Colombia is the richest country in terms of biodiversity per square kilometer in the world. And this is a tremendous asset, and we have to preserve it. and we had to preserve the tropical forest and the Amazon jungle. So one of the big challenges we have is to stop deforestation. The more we destroy those beautiful environmental woods, the forests, you will see more fires in California or more floodings in Australia. So this is something that for the world is extremely important. And thank God, Colombia has in many ways adopted a very responsible stand in contrast with some of our neighbors. We are very worried that Brazil, especially President Bolsonaro, is a climate denier. We need to work together in order to preserve the Amazon basin, which is one of the lungs of the world, and in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of climate change, is absolutely crucial. But
I should mention that it was President Santos who, just before leaving office, virtually doubled the size of Chiribiquete, which is the greatest wilderness park in all of South America. But President, one of the challenges of peace is the cost of peace, the cost of the agreement, the implementation of all the clauses of the agreement, in an environment where people often don't understand that Colombia is pressed from many sides right now. Oil prices have dropped, one of the major sources of revenue. And of course, unbeknownst, it seems, or ignored by the world, is that Colombia has had to absorb the greatest humanitarian crisis in the history of Latin America. 1.8 million Venezuelans who have come fleeing that regime into Colombia. And I dare say that they're not being turned away at the border as the Americans are doing to desperate mothers and children along the Mexican frontier. In Colombia, those children are being welcomed. They're being fed, housed, given medical care, put into schools at tremendous cost, even when Colombia needs every dollar it has to implement the terms of a peace agreement, which called essentially almost for a transformation of the opportunities of the rural Colombian people. So Colombia is under tremendous pressure. And I want to stress again that the ultimate enemy of peace is cocaine. And anybody who uses cocaine, anyone who distributes cocaine, anyone who pays the slightest heed to that market, except seeking the cleansing stroke of legalization, which could finally eliminate the market, has Colombia's agonies on their souls. And it's hard for me, President Santos, to know how ultimately stability can come to Colombia until we end this folly of a war on drugs, which has only left 50 years on, a cost of $1 trillion in the United States alone, more people in more places using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. Colombia's agonies simply would not have unfolded. They would not have occurred had it not been for the international drug trade.
Absolutely. And this war on drugs globally was declared more than 50 years ago. June 1971, President Nixon made a declaration, there's a world war on drugs. And this war has not been won, and a war that has gone on for more than 50 years that has not been won means that it has been lost. And Colombia is the country that has suffered the most of any country in the world in this war on drugs. We've lost our best leaders, our best judges, our best policemen, our best journalists. The bloodshed that the cartels have produced in Colombia has no comparison to any other country, including Mexico today. And we have tried everything. I personally, and this is, I'm sorry to speak in first person, but I was a very hardliner against the whole drug trafficking, and I used the traditional punitive method to combat drugs. As Minister of Defense, as President, and probably the person who sprayed the most hectares of coca plants, who eradicated more hectares in the world, who put in jail or in a grave more drug pins. I extradited more than 1,400 people, drug traffickers, to the United States, and yet we are still the number one exporter of cocaine to world markets. So we're like in a static bicycle. Why? Why? Because the approach of prohibiting everything that has to do with drugs is counterproductive. We have to fight the drug traffickers. We have to fight the mafias, but we cannot go after the peasants that have no alternatives, and we cannot go after the consumers. They're not criminals; they are sick people. And so there's an approach that we have to change. And thank God that it started to change, but we need to change it faster to take the bad money out of the mafias, give it to the state. The state controls the traffic, and with that money, they can do what they're doing with tobacco or with alcohol, teach the young kids not to use drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as you have prohibition, this war will not be won. There's an anecdote that I use very often that encapsulates what I'm trying to say. In the last biography of Winston Churchill, there's a story about him arriving through Canada to California during Prohibition, and he asked for a whiskey, and they said, "No, Mr. Churchill, this is prohibited here in this country." And he said, "Oh, how strange this country is! These fabulous amounts of money that are made out of the sale of liquor, you give them to the mafias. In my country, we give it to the treasury." That, in a way, encapsulates what the change that we have to make. And I think, as you said, Wade, as long as you have these millions of consumers in the United States, in Europe, and all around the world, there's going to be a supply of drugs. And they sometimes accuse me, "No, you want to poison, or are you in favor of the consumption of drugs?" Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah.
But with my experience, I've become much more practical, and I think we need to change the approach to this war on drugs. That, as I said at the beginning, it's been a failure after 50 years.
You know, President Santos, what you just said reminds me so much of a couple of things. There's a question in the chat that says, do you agree that in some cases war is necessary to make peace? And one of the extraordinary things in your history is, as you just said, that you were a very, very strong advocate of the traditional ways of treating drug trafficking and coca production, but you had the courage to change your point of view, informed by reality and the facts. And at the same time, as the Minister of Defense under President Uribe, who came into office in 2002, vowing to use a mano duro, a firm hand, the two of you let the FARC know, in part with aid from Plan Colombia, which I think is probably one of the very best foreign aid initiatives the Americans have ever done. You brought a whole new playing field to the conflict. And then, of course, when you were elected president in 2010, you defied expectations by turning all of your energies, even risking your reputation and career, even enduring denunciations from former supporters on the right, as you turned all of your energy toward a single-minded quest for peace. And I remember there's a wonderful documentary that was made of your life where someone challenged you on that and said, "Well, why on earth did you betray what?" And you just said, "Well, in war, one makes peace with one's enemies." And I thought that was the most extraordinary phrase. So tell us a little bit about that journey from warrior to peacemaker.
Yes, the question is a good question, and the answer is yes. Sometimes you have to make war in order to achieve peace, and that is one of the reasons why I became Minister of Defense, and I led the war, but I changed the way of making war. If this is not a contradiction, I don't know what it is, but what I wanted to do was to humanize the war. So I changed the military doctrine. I told the soldiers, no more body count. We unfortunately had copied from the U.S. The Vietnam body count, and the officers were evaluated by how many bodies they were able to present to their superiors, and that made the war an atrocious war. Every war is atrocious, but in this case, the human rights of also the communities and everybody were violated in the worst ways. So I changed the way of making war, and I told my soldiers, you will win the war because you are legitimate, but you have to win the hearts of the people for them to help you. And they started to do that with the help of the US, of the Great Britain, and many countries. We made a sort of a cultural change in our armed forces, and we became much more successful. The death rate went down. The people we captured, or that the guerrillas that demobilized, started to go up, and that was what brought the FARC to the negotiating table. And yes, I was called a traitor because many people had elected me in order to continue the war because I was a war hero. And when I said, no more war, we have to sit down and negotiate peace, said, you betrayed us, you're a traitor. That usually happens in many peace processes. One of the examples is Rabin in Israel, when he made peace with Arafat. It cost him his life. He was killed because of that, because they considered him a traitor. But you cannot make war for the sake of making war. If you make war, if you have to make war, you have to have peace as your ultimate purpose. And so, yes, I changed from a hawk to a dove. It's a very difficult change politically. And they warned me that it was going to be very costly. It still is. I'm still considered a traitor by many people because now the guerrillas are not kidnapping or blowing the pipelines or taking over small villages. They are in Congress. And some people say, no, how can you allow these people who committed these atrocities to be in Congress? And I have to explain, well, this is what peace is all about. They gave up their arms, and they have the right to pursue their political ideology, but non-violent democratic means. And it's not easy. It's very difficult. Many people, especially a war that has gone on for so long, leaves scars of various sizes, and these scars are and these wounds are very difficult to heal. But we are healing them. We are in the process of reconciliation. Every peace process has two phases. The peacemaking, which we did quite rapidly, 6 years of negotiation, the demobilization, the disarmament, and the reintegration of the insurgency into civil life. And then the second phase is peace. You have to peace constructing. You have to construct the peace. You have to reconcile the society, and that's more difficult, much more difficult, because you have to persuade people to learn how to forgive, persuade people to accept your former enemy, which I don't call enemy but adversary, as a part of your society, and you have to deal with them. Sometimes it's hard, but a word that I use very much to any student of leadership, you need empathy, and perseverance. You need to persevere. And that's what we're trying to do in Colombia right now, with all kinds of difficulties because it's not easy, but we're going in the correct path.
But, President, I think what will secure peace in Colombia is the heart and soul of the Colombian people who are tired of violence, who won't go back to the old ways. I'm just going to read you a little short paragraph from the book that touches upon this. Herman Ferro, this wonderful anthropologist who's the director of the one museum dedicated to the Rio Magdalena in Onda. And this is a direct quote that I think will really touch you. He says, I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena. These are the two great arms of the Magdalena Basin. He went on, I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of place, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace. A river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much, and there we were by its waters as peace came over the land. And I can tell you, President, that in the 5 years that I worked on this book, something like that sentiment was expressed by every Colombian I met. To clean our country's soul, we must clean the river. To clean the river will be to clean the soul. It's hard for people who don't know Colombia to understand the extent to which every family has suffered. You can go out to a dinner in Bogota, and suddenly in the middle of a dinner, someone says, my uncle was held by the FARC on that Paramo. And then someone else says, oh, my sister was held there too, as if they've discovered that their family members went to the same high school together. And yet Colombians have managed to absorb this agony and still find their way toward peace. It is a collective spirit, I think, of the Colombian people that will come together. And I think the two sides of the political spectrum in Colombia, created by a divide that has deep historical roots, may in fact find their way together as collectively the Colombian people protect the land itself, the rivers, the biodiversity, the cienagas, the oceans, because one of the things, again, President Santos, people don't understand is that Colombia is the only nation state born in its revolution in a vision of natural history. Simon Bolivar, who liberated not a few little bits and pieces of Atlantic seaboard, but an entire continent, who rode 75,000 miles to do so, had in the saddlebags of his horse the maps that were drawn by Alexander von Humboldt. In other words, Humboldt spoke of metaphors about the beauty of nature. The conqueror, the liberator, Simon Bolivar, took that to be real. For him, Spain represented those who wanted to destroy the land that they loved so much. And the patriots were those who wanted to protect it. And so you can really say that unlike almost any other country, the protection of nature in Colombia is the essential act of patriotism. And the desecration of nature, therefore, by definition, becomes almost an act of treason. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor as a country emerges into a new era of peace. And I'll tell you this, for those of you in the audience, the only danger in going to Colombia today, and it's a very serious danger, is that you will never want to come back. So if you're prepared to take that risk, I would book a flight for Colombia as soon as you possibly can.
And Wade, you were saying that a few moments ago that the soul and the hearts of Colombians will make peace and reconciliation possible. And I am convinced. I'm an optimist because I've had many experiences with the people who have suffered, as the person who just you mentioned, Mr. Ferro, in the Cauca River. I will tell you an anecdote that for me was extremely, extremely important to continue in this process. This is a lady. Her name is Pastora Mira. She lives in the department of Antioquia. Her father had been killed. Her brother had been killed. Her husband had been killed. And she was with her son. And her son was taken away, tortured, and killed. And suddenly, about 3 or 4 weeks later, somebody wounded came to her house asking for help. And she helped him. She cured him. And when this person was cured, was going to walk away, he saw a photograph of the lady who cured him and his son, and he was shocked and said, "Is that your son?" And she said, that was my son. And he said, "I am so sorry," and started to cry. I must tell you, I was the one who tortured and killed your son." And she was, of course, very shocked. They stood in front of each other for 1 or 2 minutes, and then suddenly she embraced him. And he was shocked. "Why do you embrace me?" And she said, "Thank you." And he said, why do you thank me? I tortured and killed your son." And she said, "But by doing what you just did, of crying and telling me that you are responsible, you liberated me from living the rest of my life full of hate. I forgive you." That anecdote went to the bottom of my heart. And that is the type of anecdotes that re-energize you to continue in this process of reconciliation and the pursuit of peace, a permanent pursuit of peace.
You know, President Santos is so moving. It reminds me of any number of people I met, not with stories quite as dramatic, but similar tales of agony and forgiveness, loss. And when you think of even an entire town like Puerto Barrio, which is a small port on the Rio Magdalena, and one of the things that the paramilitaries did, and just so people understand the structure of the war, before President Santos, and as Minister of Defense with President Uribe, were able to quadruple the size of the Colombian army. The army was not large. It wasn't that particularly well equipped. The guerrillas could strike anywhere. Paramilitary forces grew up to protect local wealthy landowners, and they couldn't be everywhere, and the FARC could strike anywhere. And so to have a presence everywhere, they resorted, frankly, to terror, which is why they became responsible for 80% of the killings. And that is why the war became so gruesome. And one of the ways of inducing terror was to kill victims and throw them into the Rio Magdalena, which in a way was to kill them twice, a physical death, but also a spiritual death, because they were not allowed to have final rites and therefore were not able, according to the Catholic faith, to the ascent to the side of God. So it was a particularly terrible fate that became emblematic of the horrors of the war. And by this small town of Puerto Barrio, the river has eddies and whirlwinds and patterns that cause debris, including floating bodies, to accumulate. And at first the fishermen tried to turn their eyes, because they'd been told if they did anything to take these bodies out of the water, they themselves would be in the river alongside them. But finally they said, no, enough. And bit by bit, they began to literally harvest the dead from the river. And they didn't just harvest them and bury them. They identified them as the NANAs, those without names. And they brought them into their own personal lineages, baptizing them with their family names of huge significance in a Catholic country and gave them burials, maintained the graves. And what they were essentially saying, as my friend Juan Manuel Echeverria, a great Colombian artist who has done any number of exhibits on this incredible phenomena, said, they were saying, we don't care. You can kill us. You can do whatever you want. But we are here. This is our town. You came to us, and we will not turn our backs on you. It's the most extraordinary sort of civic statement of courage and hope. And so this is a great thing about Colombia. Wherever you go, no matter what has gone on, people find their way to redemption and grace. And it becomes personally moving simply to visit the nation, to just spend time with the family, to go into the endless forests of the Amazon, to cross the great llanos, to climb up to the volcanic peaks, to be in the Paramos, to be everywhere you go, you find the essence of the most extraordinary country. And I've been to almost every country on earth, and there's just no nation that can compare to Colombia. So in that sense, it's just a fantastic privilege to be able to speak like this with President Santos. And I'm looking at the questions, and I think we've covered most of them. I don't see any here, Carrie, that really jump out. Let me ask you, President Santos, about the peace process today. I mean, one of the challenges is that within a year of the peace being signed, homicide rates in Colombia dropped to levels not seen since 1974. And yet the federal state, under the presidency of the current president, Duque, was, it seems to me, distracted by Venezuela, struggling with oil prices dropping, having been elected to modify, if not dismantle, the peace agreement by one side of the political spectrum, was sort of slow to get into these areas, and who did get into the areas were the cocaine mafia and the bandidos, and as civil society raised its head, the one unfortunate thing that has happened since the peace agreement is that whereas the country itself has become much safer, to the extent that in 2016, virtually half of Colombians traveled within their homeland for the first time, there have been a great number of individual civic leaders and social leaders killed, in which is sort of a blemish on the agreement. What can be done to bring ultimate security to all parts of Colombia? That seems to be of some urgency.
And it is, Wade, it is. The social leaders that are being killed, they're being killed for various reasons that have to do in a way with the peace process. The peace process, for example, one of the points in the agenda was precisely to start a program of voluntary substitution of the coca plants for legal plants, legal crops. And this started with great success because the problem is replanting, and replanting went down almost to nil, less than 1%. And that was verified by the United Nations. And so the drug traffickers said, my God, we're going to lose our raw material. And so they started killing the leaders of the promoters of the voluntary substitution. Another aspect of the peace process was that all the peasants, the campesinos that had been displaced by violence, many times by big landlords or big drug traffickers that simply displaced them and bought illegally the land, big area. Well, they have to give it back to the original peasants. Well, they don't want to. So the people who are claiming with their legal rights their land, some of them or many of them have been killed. what does the government have to do? Be more effective. You can control that by something that in military terms is called territorial control. And territorial control is not only have more soldiers or more policemen. You need to also bring social development to these regions. And we did in the peace process 17 different plans that were consulted with the communities for the 17 regions that were most affected by the war. And what the government has to do is be more effective in implementing those plans and in securing the territory in terms of the control of the territory. This can be done. It needs political will, more political will, because they have the support of the community. The communities want that. They're asking for that. Many of the protests that you have seen in Colombia have to do with the lack of implementation of the peace process. But you have it there, and I hope that we can continue pressing the government to be more effective in the implementation of the peace process.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful explanation. And I'm just going to now invite many of the attendees to take these conversations into your breakout sessions in the Jubilo rooms. And I think the kind of the question that has come out of all of this dialogue is one that applies to Colombia, but also the world, which is what type of leadership is needed to bring about a peace process? What does it involve? And how can these qualities be perhaps applied to other leading frontline organizations? And so with that, I'd like to personally and for the entire group thank from the bottom of my heart President Juan Manuel Santos for joining us on this session, an ongoing inspiration to the world. I know that his memoir is about to come out. When is your book being published, President Santos?
I think in a couple of months. It's already been printed, I think, and I hope it'll come in English because in Spanish it's already published.
Oh, good. Well, I encourage everybody to read that because it's a real chronicle of heroism, duty, honor, and patriotism, and love of country and people. So thank you very much, President Santos, and we'll now shift over to our next session, I believe.
No, and thank you, Wade. Thank you, Wade, for you that do not know is our compatriot, and I'm honored to have him as a compatriot because he's now also a Colombian that honors Colombia as being one of us. And thank you for being so kind with us and with Colombia always, Wade. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of you for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wade and President Santos, for that incredible conversation. And thank you all for joining. Now, this is just a friendly reminder that if you are a Summit Fellow or a Summit Junto member, you know, Summit's new membership program where we build you a Summit Personal Advisory Board, go to your agenda and click Backstage, where you'll be able to engage in a breakout and town hall with the speakers. Now, for all community members and partner organizations, Wade and President Santos gave us a great prompt to discuss. So click on the tabletops and go engage with other community members about the session.